My name is Taylor Adkins. I am going to be talking about adapting to climate change in California's Channel Islands. So if anyone else like me has been sitting here all day, you're well aware that human-caused climate change is causing a multitude of problems, not limited to rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events. However, there's more at stake than meets the eye. The world is experiencing a sixth mass extinction, characterized by a rapid loss of species and ecosystems on a global scale. And I'm interested in finding solutions to mitigate the effects of climate change on these ecosystems. So to identify the climate stressors affecting organisms, I looked at one of California's most biodiverse regions, Channel Islands National Park. So for context, although globally only 6% of land area are islands, 20% of the world's biodiversity exists in island habitats. Island ecosystems also host 50% of the world's threatened species and 75% of the known extinctions. Channel Islands National Park and Marine Sanctuary has 145 unique species found nowhere else on Earth. The images here show two of the endemic species on the islands. In the top left, you can see the island shrub jay, and in the bottom is the island fox. It's also an important place for migratory animals like birds and whales to stop over. Here's a schematic of my study site. The Channel Islands are located 20 miles west of Ventura off the coast of California. In totality, they're made up of 8 islands. However, the national park is 4 of the northern islands and 1 of the southern islands, highlighted in the schematic on the right: San Miguel Island, Santa Rosa Island, Santa Cruz Island, Anacapa Island, and Santa Barbara. There are also 6 miles of protected national marine sanctuary surrounding all 5 of the islands. And it's also a place with rich cultural history, inhabited by Native American Chumash and Tongva Indians at least 13,000 years ago. So a general overview of my project. Because of its isolated geography, many endemic species have evolved to the unique climate of the islands, but that isolation has now become a threat because of climate change. There have been previous climate assessments of the islands, so to build upon the body of work, I identified the research gaps and filled in some of the missing pieces. I also worked with the Nature Conservancy and the National Park Service to identify their specific needs, which led me to trying to understand how climate characteristics manifest differently at different spatial and temporal scales. In doing this, I located areas where multiple microclimates can provide refuge for species to adapt to climate change. I started by identifying 3 climate scales relative to the geography of my research. The macroclimate, which determines physical processes on the global scale. The mesoclimate, which are climate conditions at an intermediate geographic scale. So, for example, each island has its own unique climate. And the microclimate, which is the scale at which organisms experience change. The complexity of physical processes on the island stems from their 2 very unique but connected ecosystems. For that reason, I was curious about how climate change is affecting the marine ecosystem as well as the terrestrial ecosystem. The microclimate framework that I created focused on the terrestrial ecosystem, but can be adopted to the marine ecosystem for further research. First, I wanted to quantify the connections between the terrestrial and marine habitats. So I did an analysis of the local air temperature in red and sea surface temperature in blue anomalies for all 5 of the islands. And across the board, temperature fluctuates around the mean, but fluctuations are highly correlated everywhere over the region. This is especially evident between 2014 and 2016 as the marine heat wave affects everything in the same way. It shows that air temperature and sea surface temperature are significant drivers of the other. Next, I looked at global change or macroclimate. The Channel Islands are located in a region with a Mediterranean climate type. So I used data from CMIP-5 climate models to look at the projected changes in the Mediterranean climate type over the islands. The gray here symbolizes the current Mediterranean climate type, and the red symbolizes the Mediterranean climate type shift on the highest emissions scenario by 2100. You can see that locally over the Channel Islands, the climate type is shifting by end of century in the graph on the right. So why is this relevant? In recent years, some tropical bird species have been showing up on the islands and have recently started breeding there. For example, the brown booby nested on Santa Barbara Island in 2019. This signifies a northward expansion of their known breeding range and also highlights the potential for current species on the island to reach their thermal thresholds. Another climate stressor, marine heat waves, are becoming more intense and more frequent with climate change. So I looked at the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave. The graph shows the yearly average increase in temperature from 2012 to 2016. It's rising everywhere, and there are significant increases from the mean. What's happening during the marine heat wave is pretty dramatic, and it's like having a forest fire in the marine habitat. I wanted to look at this because marine heat wave events can give us an idea of how the ecosystem may change in the future. For example, the park experienced a mass die-off of seabirds, seals, and sea lions due to the migration of their food sources during this time, because a lot of them experienced starvation. To really understand the extent of impact that climate change has on the environmental conditions within the park, I also needed to scale down my analysis from the global to an intermediate scale, which I termed mesoclimate. At this scale, I found temperature gradients affecting the islands independent of background climate change. This was evident in 3 variables that I looked at: sea surface temperature, air temperature, and precipitation. This is a spatial plot of sea surface temperature. It shows a clear temperature gradient among the 5 islands, where the warmer water is in the southeast near Santa Barbara Island, and the cooler water is in the west near San Miguel. The differences in yearly mean between the islands are up to 4 degrees Celsius, which is significant. On the right, there's a clear identification of the sea surface temperature gradient in the summer months, whereas in the winter months, the gradient nearly disappears, showing a more homogeneous climate scenario among the islands in these months. This indicates that climate differences are not only spatially unique, but also seasonally. I also wanted to illustrate the effects of warm and cool currents on the islands, as you can see comparing the image on the right to the image on the left. The California current is associated with poleward and equatorward changes because of climate change. The ocean currents are projected to speed up, and therefore the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich waters will be affected, which will have ecologically significant effects for the islands. These changes will also cause disruptions to the normal state, potentially changing the range or magnitude of the gradient that you see on the left. Then on the same spatial scale, I looked at air temperature. As predicted, the air temperature gradient for this region highly correlates with the sea surface temperature gradient. On the right, you can see that the furthest northwest point on San Miguel to the furthest southeast point of Anacapa Island, the temperature difference is up to 4 degrees Celsius. Finally, I looked at average precipitation over the islands. On the left shows the spatial patterns of precipitation, and on the right, the mean annual precipitation for each island. If you look at many global climate models or projections on the macro scale, you'll see that on average, precipitation is projected to increase overall, but at a statistically insignificant rate. Here you can see that precipitation trends differ between the islands. For example, on San Miguel Island, precipitation trends have increased over time, while for the same period on Santa Barbara Island, the precipitation trend has decreased over time. The result of my mesoscale analysis proves that climate variability manifests differently in different regions. The 5 islands each have different climate characteristics and therefore different ecosystems. Finally, I wanted to understand to what extent biodiversity and natural resources are affected for each unique climate as temperatures increase and precipitation patterns change. In 2020, California's Governor Gavin Newsom established the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order as part of California's 30 by 30 initiative, which aims to conserve 30% of coastal waters in California and land by 2030. In order to understand these ecosystem functions, I looked at historical changes over the islands. What I found was that past livestock grazing, pig rooting, and excessive vegetation changes have caused localized downward trends in soil resources, which has led to a decline in vegetation and water availability. The final analysis required downscaling my assessment from the macro and mesoscale to the microclimate, or the scale at which organisms experience global change. Microclimates can have a range of temperature values that differ from the broader climate, 9 degrees Celsius on average and up to 26 degrees Celsius. So to determine microclimates on the islands, I looked at different topographic features, and here I've created elevation and slope maps for San Miguel Island, as well as hillshade and aspect. I mapped out the topographic features for all 5 islands. All of these topographic and physical features create a greater range of differences than the global, manifesting unique environmental conditions which can help sustain ecosystem function. So I identified the various microclimates within the park's boundaries. As you can see, Santa Barbara and Anacapa Islands have more homogeneous climates, whereas the larger, more western islands have various climate types, which can provide refuge for organisms reaching temperature thresholds. I also mapped out various cool and hot zones within each island. Because plants and animals tend to thrive in a narrow temperature range, they seek cooler ground when temperatures rise and warmer grounds when temperatures fall. Here you can see the specific areas which, on average, experience the highest highs and the lowest lows. The result of my microscale analysis proves that climate variability also manifests differently in different topographic regions, which can have a great buffering effect on species adapting to climate change. So, in conclusion, accurately predicting the future of Channel Islands requires ecosystem downscaling to incorporate all of the complexities associated with climate change. My key takeaways from my research were there were strong climate connections between the marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Shifting ocean currents and wind patterns drive temperature changes and cause feedback loops. Organisms' upper temperature thresholds are being exceeded more frequently and by greater magnitudes. Ecosystem downscaling is essential to understanding these complex processes, and identifying microclimates and refugia are important climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. So, in conclusion, the study is merely a start to ongoing research needs. Sorry, guys. Let's go through these again. Which leads me to my recommendations for future research and looking into the magnitude and frequency of projected changes to the California current system, changes in wind patterns, including the Santa Ana winds, and other decoupled changes that can affect temperature gradients, poleward and equatorward species distributions, the effects of increased frequency and heat waves, and feedback loops between the terrestrial and marine ecosystems, including fog inundation and correlations between the water cycle and vegetation chains. And finally, field observations are necessary to identify microclimates and climate refugia with confidence. So to end, I want to introduce a strong cultural voice within the disenfranchised Native American Chumash community. During my research, I was able to make a trip to Santa Cruz Island and meet with Matthew Vestudo, who has dedicated his life to the survival of language and culture. Here are some of his perspectives. Do we have sound?
I don't want to sound combative or anything, but when I woke up this morning and I thought, okay, I'm going to go and talk about climate change, and if they ask me, what do you think of climate change? The short answer is that's a you problem. Our culture is not responsible for a lot of the ills that we experience today, but we all have a common destiny. The word preservation, preserves are something you can in order to eat. Most people think of preservation as just cordoning off something and not letting any human interaction occur. I was talking to an archaeologist on a military base, and I asked, can we collect this certain stone there? And he says, no, we're preserving this site. I'm like, for what? This is a site our ancestors exploited. He goes, no, I understand, and I know he understands, but that's his mandate, is to preserve. And I'm not interested in preserving our language. I'm interested in a living culture. But what was the question again?
Okay, last I want to thank my capstone committee, Mark Merrifield, who was my committee chair, Carrie Schloss and Nick Holmes from the Nature Conservancy, and Matthew Vestudo, who you just saw in the video. Thank you. Questions? Yash? Yeah. You? Whoever.
Me first. Amazing job, Taylor.
Thanks.
I'm curious what other insights you gained from incorporating Matthew's perspective.
Yeah, interesting question. I thought it was cool because I was doing all of this research kind of in the background, and I kind of got like there's this rich cultural history, and I knew I wanted to incorporate him. But you kind of get like really honed into your research, and you kind of forget to zoom out a little bit. But the thing that he ended up saying in the last scene in the video was actually just in response to, it wasn't really part of the interview, it was actually in response to something that I had said, which was I used the word preservation, and he is a linguist. He's like revives the language of like the Chumash language all down the coast, and he was actually like, we're not actually preserving anything. Like as climate changes, we're shifting and adapting, and it's really a living culture. And so he kind of just like highlighted the importance of like the language that we use in scientific research, and I thought that was interesting because it made me like really think about the fact that like Western culture has gone so far away of that sort of living culture.
Yeah, beautiful presentation. When you were talking about the hot zones and cool zones, it looked almost like some of the hottest hot zones were also the coolest cool zones.
That's
Do you know
right.
why that is?
Yeah, so definitely a lot of those topographic features that I was looking at to scale down my analysis are really important for stuff like that, but wind and cold pooling have like a big effect on sort of where those cool zones are too. So that specific area has a really interesting topography, and I can show you more detail of that.